Hello and welcome to Kalibrate's quarterly podcast, Fuel for Thought, where our fuel industry experts dive into the topics impacting the industry, the latest emerging trends and more. Join us as we discuss the latest news headlines in more detail, analyse the topics that impact you and explore best practices to optimise your organisation. In this episode, our host Kalibrate's Tom Hatton is joined by Beth Thompson, Matteo Locane and Johan Strydom to talk about how volatility over the last few years is impacting fuel pricing teams across Europe and globally, and how organisations and governments are reacting to changes in the industry.
So I'm Tom Hatton, I'm Head of Product Management for Kalibrate Pricing. I've been with Kalibrate for almost 2 years now, actually. And prior to joining Kalibrate, I was responsible for fuel pricing in one of Kalibrate's customers. So have a lot of experience across different markets, mostly in Europe, managing pricing and seeing some of the different trends that we're going to be discussing here play out and managing the aftermath as well. So I'll hand you over to Matteo.
Hello, I'm Matteo Locane. I'm the product manager for Kalibrate Pricing. Also have a background in fuel pricing. I used to look after a network of about 250 sites in Scandinavia, but I've had visibility of markets across Europe. So over to Beth.
Good morning. My name is Beth Thompson. I'm the Global VP of Customer Success here at Kalibrate, and I've been working in this particular business for about 22 years, give or take. So my experience is completely global. So I work in markets such as Australia, as well as in North America, Europe, and have been over in China as well. So, and I'll hand you over to Joe.
Hi, my name is Johan Strydom. I'm based in Switzerland. I've been with Kalibrate for all of 9.5 months. My experience is a bit deeper than that, though. I worked for one of the international oil companies for a period of 20 years, focusing mainly on strategy and planning. Then ran a consulting business with some colleagues in Africa, focusing on sub-Saharan Africa for 13 years. My current role is that of strategic account manager. I have 9 strategic accounts that are basically based in Europe, but there's a geographical spread that runs all the way from the Americas to Australia, and which I do a great deal of work with my colleagues that are the account managers in those specific geographies.
Thanks, Johan. So I think to be honest, the last 3 years have really been marred by volatility, and the most interesting thing about this volatility is it's not all coming from one place. There is not one single cause. Of course, we can all look at geopolitical events right now and see that there might be quite a large influencer of what is happening. But ultimately, there are lots and lots of different things pulling in different directions. We've had in terms of demand and supply, we've had both restrictions and then almost too much of it in both instances. If we go back to the start of 2022, so it's the start of this year, almost 7-8 months ago now, when Russia invaded Ukraine, that led to a significant shock on the supply side of fuel. So that ultimately led to quite a drastic drop. Drastic drop in the availability of supply, and ultimately led to a rather shock increase, and prices increased cumulatively by probably the most we've seen over a short period of time, and it was cumulative, as I say, so it just kept going. That is set against a backdrop of economic decline, effectively. So we have something out there called stagflation at the moment. We have inflation of prices whilst we have lower growth. Ultimately, lower growth tends to reduce demand on commodities products. So what we're seeing now is all of these groups such as OPEC talking about limiting the production of oil in order to support their prices. They've obviously been used to strong prices throughout the last 12 months, and now they have the potential of prices declining. So we've seen OPEC make that decision to cut production. I think that's gone through already. Separately to that, we have currency effects. So the last few weeks in Europe, in the UK, have been very interesting, to say the least. I don't know to what extent everybody's tuned into UK political news, but we have had quite a firestorm of it, to be honest. And our currency has been at basically parity with the US dollar. I don't know how long we have to go back, but it wasn't that long ago that it was $1.50 to the pound. So that obviously has a significant effect on fuel pricing, particularly to UK retailers, of course. And as I say, these dynamics tend to be going against each other. So the thing that fuel retailers have been having to deal with is really volatility. It's not volatility. It's not increased price pressure in either direction. It's the volatility, and it's the level of surprise or the level that this can kind of change. That you need to be able to pivot and to be able to deal with price changes, price direction in whichever way it is currently going at that time, and be able to still achieve your organization's volume and margin goals, regardless of the economic situation.
Well,
So,
of course, of course, Tom, the volatility in the oil industry is absolutely nothing new. I know you speak about the last 3 years specifically, but the oil industry from its inception has been a very volatile business. I think, I'm a very avid reader of history, and I think that's one of the reasons why I've been in the oil industry for so long, is just because it's a fantastically dynamic market. And the pressures, of course, that are building now are just at a different scale. And what you seem to talk about is something probably pretty close to a perfect storm, in the sense that it is not a singular event in a specific geography, or a supply or a demand problem that's currently occurring. It is just happening all over the place. There are economic pressures all over the place, as you've mentioned, and the economic pressures again are global. They are not regional. There's political instability, not only as far as the current conflict in Ukraine is concerned, but there are conflicts across the globe. And a lot of this is driven by economic activity. So I think one needs to understand it in that context, that the world is just in a very, very unsettled state at the moment. And
it's the sudden character of it that is particularly interesting as well, if I may interject. And if you look back at early 2020, we all know what happened. And particularly in the early days, when most of the world was in a lockdown, demand was so depressed, and you saw things like oil futures going into the negatives. And they were going into the negatives because demand was so low that there was just no storage space to take deliveries, which is something nearly unheard of. At least in my lifetime, it was definitely unheard of. And
maybe in some of those 20 years of Johan's experience history, they might have occurred.
I think that the difficulty we have as well is, coming up, we know that there are, word is on the street for the US at least that, that there is going to be a real supply issue around the end of this year and the beginning of next year. Also related to storage and to maintenance. So, that we are definitely going to see that impacting those markets as well. And I think what is really difficult for our customers, if we look at it more specifically for people who we work with and the markets that we're working with, people are trying to work against almost an unpredictable behavior, a historical picture that doesn't really give them any clues as to what works and how to address it. So, they're having to kind of plan for the unplanned, which I think is really, really interesting and quite a challenge for a lot of them.
Yeah, it is interesting, Beth, because some of the European clients that we've spoken to very specifically in terms of how this is impacting them, there are two words that have always been kind of bandied about. It's this combination of margin management and then volume management. And I think the shocks that we are seeing at the moment is making the volume manageability incredibly difficult. And the feedback that we are getting from our clients as recently as yesterday is that there's a massive focus at the moment on margin management. And when we speak on margin management, of course, it goes a lot deeper. And one of the things that's always going to be on top of all of the retailers' minds is to do cost management. So you've got to kind of funnel it down into buckets. And some of the messages that we are getting back has to do with the fact that there were pressures initially on getting staff because a lot of staff were retrenched over the period. Now it is a question of margin becoming a more defined problem for these clients, and what they are having to do is to look very, very closely at their cost base. So I think this is an interesting message. Of course, all businesses always look after their cost structure in any case, but these combinations of pressures that are building is now focusing their minds very, very much on how we actually manage our cost base.
Yeah, and I think it depends as well very much on the type of company that you're looking at, because if you look at the integrated refiners and then you look at the independents, they have very different challenges that they have to play with. And I think most of the companies that I've been talking to, have had to stop and think about how they respond. When margins are good, it's a very different scenario than when they're really, really low. And we've seen both extremes recently. And so the combination of those relatively unpredictable margins and then really unpredictable volumes, I think is making for a very tricky environment.
Just to pick up on one thing you said there, Johan, the term costs. So few retailers in particular, they've been experiencing rising costs from as a result of inflation, like everybody else. So of course, these numbers that we're talking about here, the margin and the volume, that has to contribute towards meeting a higher cost base, and of course that's changed the equation for them. But the second element of cost is that quite often a fuel retailer doesn't know what the price of their next delivery of fuel is going to be. So you don't know when you're going to run out of product necessarily, not specifically anyway. You might have a fair idea, and you don't know what that price is going to be. You don't know what currency is going to do overnight. You don't know what Platts is going to do overnight. You don't know what a lot of things are going to do. And so ultimately, that's a very challenging operating environment, particularly if you want to maintain something like a brand price, because your competition aren't necessarily always going to be operating on an equal footing to you. Their last fuel purchase could have been at a time when fuel prices were lower. It could have been at a time when they were higher. That it's a very interesting decision to have to take, a very difficult decision, and not something that you can always take in the heat of the moment. You often need to think about the longer term context, about your brand promise, and about what the markets might do. So having an awareness of these various dynamics is, of course, very important as well, so that can help to inform your pricing. But one thing that lots of our clients are able to do with Kalibrate pricing is to be able to use some of our functionality to be able to make quite large dynamic changes to their implementation of their pricing tactics, to be able to use pricing events and various properties to be able to group sites in a way that their behaviors can inform their ultimate pricing. So if you have sites that are more elastic, less elastic, they might be priced in a similar way, for instance.
Yeah, we've seen a really big change in lots of people putting in our minimum margin rules into their pricing profiles, which is just protecting that margin level. And some people are using the facility that says it needs to amend the price to bring it up to that minimum margin, and that can carry on with that automated level that we've been achieving. But also I think what's really interesting is a lot of people are having to make on the spot decisions about whether or not that margin can be tolerated. And one of the things that we've been talking a lot with our customer base about is about, to your point, Tom, knowing your company or brand strategy is really critical, because you've got to align that with the plans that you are prepared to put into place, given the various conditions that you find yourself with. So you agree with marketing, you've got your criteria for kind of when you can, or when you have to press the stop button, as it were. And it could be margin, it could be volume performance, or it could be the level of volatility in the pricing environment. We know a lot of people want to try and slow down that the responsiveness to pricing in some ways, to try to reduce some of that intraday volatility that can exist in some of our markets. But the key is having that plan, having that understanding of what it is your promises to the consumer, because if you start breaking those in your pricing, you've got bigger problems on your hands than just your performance as a company.
Well, it's also interesting. So it is an understanding of your own business and the volatility with your own business. But I think when you start talking about the customer, who these retailers of ours are dependent on at the end of the day, it's also very important, I think, to understand their different behaviors. So one of the anecdotal messages we got yesterday, for example, is that in Denmark, people are now starting to slow down their speed in terms of which they are traveling. And the reason why they are doing that, it is not an enforced governmental drive. It is a thing that the customers are doing to see how they can do their own fuel conservation. And I think it is important that one understands these trends in the market and what the consumer's behavior is doing to understand how that's going to affect your business at the end of the day.
It's interesting that it's happening in Denmark, of all places, which is one of the countries with the highest incidence of premium fuel purchases, which of course comes at a higher cost.
Yeah, they love motoring, don't they, in Denmark? Yeah, that's very interesting. So I'm not sure this will make it into the recording, but in the UK, our government have been arguing about whether to issue best practice advice on domestic energy utilization. So for something like Scandinavia, a very, very liberal country, I imagine that was a grassroots kind of a grassroots initiative. But very interesting to see the consumers taking things into their own hands as a way of ultimately holding back on demand. I
think we've seen that as well with people choosing public transport more, certainly where it's available. Obviously across the markets that we work in, there is the complete spectrum of highly available and highly cost efficient public transport. We saw in Germany that they reduced the cost of public transport massively to try to encourage train usage and what have you. All of those types of things are eroding some of the volume that the retailers are going to be seeing at their sites. So there is an element of that they cannot, they just can't control. People are going to be taking those matters into their own hands, and certainly working from home. All we need now for the winter over here is a nice big cold snap with maybe some flu thrown in, and people will go back to those people who have crept out back to working in offices and using their own transport. I drive into Manchester and I can see that the levels of traffic are back at the high levels, but it only takes one incidence of a COVID bout or a massive flu epidemic, and suddenly you'll see those volumes impacted again. So and around the holiday season, that is also a possibility if you look into North America. So it's really unpredictable. I think that's got to be the theme of this year, is unpredictable, I think.
I completely agree that the volume topic there, that's a very good point. That we do not have certainty of a continuation of the current levels of volume, and I think there are two key dynamics affecting that. One, which you said there, the risk of a lockdown, that could very much happen, or at least partial lockdown or reduced mobility as a result. They're calling it the twindemic, I think now, the COVID and flu. And then the other one, rising inflation, and with the rise of home working as well, people may be making the individual choice to commute less as a way of cutting back a way of improving disposable income. So I think that's another risk as well that could be out there for retailers volumes. Just in terms of another thing that could be negatively impacting retailers, we're approaching that time where a lot of the incentives that that national governments put in place throughout the last 6 months are starting to wear off. So across lots of Western European countries in particular, there are incentives 20-30 cent a litre that are starting to ratchet down now. And I can only imagine that will also have a further effect on demand, as well as ultimately from one day to the next, the price of fuel is going to go up by 20 to 30 cents in many of these countries.
Yes, and you see a specific intervention in some countries. For example, I mean, this leads very nicely into kind of what is happening in France at the moment. So the French government had said that they will start giving discounts to the consumers, which they've built into the fuel price. But then there are some other followers or companies that we have seen that have said to their customers that they will give them, on top of the government discounts, they will pass some of their profits on to their customers directly. And again, so now you get into a environment where you are wanting to play a game in terms of keeping your volume levels up, because they've been very specific that the discounts that they are going to be giving is going to focus on their retail customers very specifically. So it is not going to go into the commercial customers. And I suppose it is an attempt to draw people back onto their forecourts. So that's just one of the examples that we've seen, not at an international level, but at a country level, and then at a localized market level, where there are interventions at multiple levels, either from international oil companies or governments.
Absolutely. And I'm not going to comment on the nature of French capitalism, because that will never make it into the recording. But I will say what happened there. And it has a massive impact on the market, particularly in a market like France, where fuel prices are publicly available. So any citizen can check a government website and see the prices. And I'm sure Tom has done the same experiment as I've done. If you pick a random city and you go and look at the prices and you rank them from cheapest to highest, and all of a sudden the first 2 or 3 pages are all the same retailer, because of this additional rebate that comes on top of the rebate that has been provided by the government. But what happens when this is taken away? And this is already being taken away. Particularly the government one was halved, I think, at the beginning of the month. And the retailer-specific one was also halved and may not continue into the next year. And that really translates into 10, 20 cents more at the pump from one day to the other for the average customer. How does that affect, on one hand, their buying behavior, on the other hand, their perception of the industry as a whole as well?
So the total of the cut at the moment is actually 50 cents a litre. So the government have given 30 cents, which will drop to 10 cents on the 31st of October. The same day, one of the retailers in France, their incentive will drop from 20 cents to 10 cents. To a customer, the price of fuel will quite literally be 50 cents different. Well, sorry, it's actually going to be 30 cents, isn't it? Because they're only dropping it. But when this expires, the size of the subsidy is 50 cents a litre. That's material. And as Matteo says, France is one of the more mature markets out there in France. The brands tend, the pricing tends to be closer together, and there's not volatility intraday. There's no restoration cycles or that sort of stuff, and so that's a significant spread that you're now seeing in price across a country that's been used to having quite a high degree of consistency. And I suppose that brings us on to a piece of news that came out today, which is that the UK government are also looking at doing something similar around making available pump price data. So that what they're doing apparently in Northern Ireland already is a scheme where they are surveying petrol stations, making that data then available to the consumer, so that the consumer has the ability to compare prices. I think it's going to be quite an interesting thing to see play out. I don't think a decision has been made on this. I think this is quite early in the process. But yeah, I just wondered, what did you guys think the impact would be on the resulting pump price situation in the UK if the government go ahead with this?
I have a very strong opinion on this, because we've seen it in so many markets that this availability of the data, it is both brilliant and horrific at the same time, because those people who are price sensitive enough to look at consumer provided data or government provided data for the consumer, those people have already been looking. They've already been making their own checks on either, products like Waze or GasBuddy or whoever it is, in whichever market. We have seen that the introduction of the MTSK data in Germany aligned itself with the introduction of extreme volatility in terms of the numbers of price changes, not in the absolute values of those price changes, but in the numbers of price changes in the day, where you are looking in most German markets from 8 to 15 price changes, but you have seen up to 30 price changes a day, and those are triggered purely because this feed from the MTSK data is constant. So there is never a downtime. Somebody is always moving somewhere. So any strategy that you put into place to delay your response, for example, is still getting that noise in the background of those feeds. So from a company perspective, from a retailer perspective, they are being drowned in data, which can make for a very reactive environment. And from a consumer perspective, actually, Edgeworth cycles as a whole have been shown to not necessarily have any huge benefit. There was a study done actually many years ago in Germany, which did exactly this, and it said that there wasn't any end result benefit to the consumer. They were no better off by having these types of Edgeworth cycle in the economy than they would be if people just were behaved a little bit more like, say, the English market, which is much less volatile in terms of numbers of price changes per day. So I think I am interested to see how it goes, but I think that for super price sensitive consumers, I think they're already looking for that data, and I think therefore we've got a real risk that all we do is increase the volatility of price, or the velocity maybe of price changes in markets which don't necessarily benefit from it. I think the other thing that is interesting is without the context of those prices. So if I look at an independent who is on a very different contract to an integrated refiner or to a massive, super store that has huge volume and purchase power, they're very different cost bases that they're going to have, and therefore just looking at the absolute price without looking at anything else that is offered around that service, they may be the only station in that village or in that environment, and have much higher overheads. But if you look at it on an absolute price position, it can give a very bad impression for those independents, or those who have not got that purchase power.
Yeah, it is just interesting, because I think one of the risk factors, and I think as far as our clients are concerned, so I come from a market historically which has been highly regulated. In these markets, so I'm speaking about the African markets particularly, but you get the same impact in the South American markets, where the pricing is highly regulated, so retailers can't compete on price, and they have to compete mainly on their brands and on their locations. And of course, this is a key part of the Kalibrate business. And my only concern, I suppose, with this noise, this economic noise, the political noise that is going on, is that people take a very short-term approach to managing their cost. Of course, it's a key part of the business, but you also have to lift your head and then understand that there is a medium and a longer term issue at play here. So the importance of making sure that the quality of your network that's in place, not only in deregulated markets, but in regulated markets, also are driving your future decisions about where you are going to be doing capital deployment. And of course, Kalibrate has some fantastic tools to assist with us. So I I suppose that is just the one risk that I flag, is that we kind of put these blinkers on and just look at today and forget that there is a tomorrow that we still have to plan for and make sure that our networks are optimized to meet that challenge.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that my advice is always to have that pre-agreed plan. I think I alluded to it earlier, knowing what those highs and lows are that you're prepared to work to, and have those plans for exceptional circumstances. It cast in stone, really. People have already agreed them. You've already done the legwork to make sure that you understand what you would do in extreme circumstances, almost like playbooks. And the reason for that is so that we remove that emotion, really, from any of the decisions that are made, be that investment decisions or be that day-to-day pricing decisions.
Yeah, during these times of extreme difficulty as well, you might start looking at other sources of data. So for a Kalibrate customer who's going through a situation where there's been price volatility as a result of, to pick an example, let's say there's been an extreme supply issue. Suddenly, the availability of product at a location is an important piece of data. So being able to take that information, do something with it, put it into your pricing tool, and then make a decision based partly upon that. It is something, for example, that a fuel retailer might do, and that's something that I've seen Kalibrate customers do. It's something that Kalibrate empowers, enabling you to be a bit more, enabling you to be very dynamic in the way that you price and the type of information that you use. In terms of how you come to that final price decision, how you might select your competitors to include, etc. I won't go into too much detail about the exact example I'm talking about, but I'm sure you can imagine it. But as Beth says, essentially what I'm trying to say is there's no reason not to playbook this stuff. You can imagine the most likely difficult situations. There are a supply shock, there are a demand shock, and in both directions. Figure out what you're going to do. Have a look at your major competitors. Think about what they might do, how you might respond to them. As Beth was saying earlier, when you're thinking about introducing pump price volatility, when you're thinking about making pump price changes or changes to the way that you price, understand that your competition are going to react to that. So there's not your decisions are not made in a vacuum. They are made in the context of the wider market, and I think that's something to always be aware of. And of course, time as well. Your decisions, the effect of your decisions takes place over a longer period of time than just the amount of time that decision is in place for, because of the knock-on effects. So the oil industry went through a divestment process over the last sort of 25 years almost now at this stage, and that has led to the supply chain being different everywhere almost, but also quite long. So you have a lot of touch points, a lot of companies that need to add their value to make their profit, and to make that sale. And you also have different models of this in the same geographies. So we were talking about France earlier, and a fuel retailer who was able to give a discount. The reason they're able to give that discount is because they manage the entire integrated supply chain. So right the way from refinery through to the pumps. They're in a market where they're competing against people who do not have control of the full integrated supply chain. So to those other retailers who are perhaps buying their fuel from a non-integrated oil company, that's a more challenging situation to be in. And that was something that perhaps not many people saw coming, that particular dynamic in France right now. But that's certainly an interesting one. And I wonder how in the future the varied nature of these supply chains might have continued effect upon the retailers who are making these price decisions.
I was gonna make a very similar point on that. I mean, Beth had already mentioned, different market players can have very different cost bases, because you can have a vertically integrated player who can afford to do actions such as offering, a further discount on pump price, or you can have someone else who is buying according to a fixed formula and has to pay brand fees and all sorts of fees that are non-removable and non-negotiable, really. Or you can have even an independent who is buying kind of opportunistically on the spot and might have a bit more wiggle room for things. But how that relates to what's happening right now, and these massive price differences that you're seeing as due to actions that some players can take and some cannot, they're going to end up affecting brand perception as well. So do they have a long-term impact on their volumes as well? Because people do build their own perception, and that's true even in countries where price information is not publicly available. We used to run market research in a number of countries, and if two things that constantly came up were, on one hand, there is always a percentage of bargain hunters. So there is always a percentage of people who are looking for the cheapest price that they can get. And whether that's immediately obvious or not, and they have to look at the price signs every day, they will do that. But on the other hand, what was quite interesting, and we saw that in multiple countries, okay, price is the number one deciding factor very often. The second one, interestingly, is price stability. People do not like their volatility. They do much prefer to see prices moving in a kind of slow and steady manner. So what happens when the incentives end, the music stops, and all of a sudden the prices go up 20 cents?
Yeah. No, I completely agree. And I think as well, one of the areas of loyalty that's really powerful is being able to build not just on price discounts, but being able to keep that customer coming back to you over and over again because they feel part of that brand. They are aligned with that brand's values. We're seeing a really different conversation coming out from the different brands around the world about who they are, and their consumers then are making those choices to be part of their pack, and that loyalty program, I think, is massive for that. We saw recently some huge activity in North America that was driven by price, but the resulting marketing and brand noise that came out of it was huge, and that will have brought new people into focus and people who thought, oh, okay, these are good people to be aligned with. So it's really interesting for me to see that. But we're also seeing people who are looking at ways of offsetting what they do, having more of an environmental and conscience, I suppose, which is also aligning to some of the younger consumers. So it's really interesting for me to see how that loyalty piece can play into that as well. So that is something that the data that we hold, I think, really becomes really powerful, because we're seeing a lot of people understanding where they're aligning their loyalty programs, their pricing, what the competition are doing, and where they're seeing that footfall in their stores or that footfall at their pumps either increase or remain consistent. Consistency is not a bad word. In fact, it's quite a nice thing in retail sometimes. So I think we're really seeing some of that come to the fore, where loyalty is becoming a really big voice for that, because pricing in itself, it can't be the only driver, and we know it isn't the only driver from all of the other work that we do.
So with the extreme volume volatility, I think one thing that retailers have been challenged with quite a lot lately is being able to actually predict what they should be able to achieve in a month. And quite often, this is actually an annual process whereby you will go through a budget setting process, and you'll decide, okay, this month I think I'm going to sell this amount of fuel based upon these trends from the past, based upon the fact that diesel is dropping by 3%, that unleaded is picking up by 2.5%, or whatever the global or potentially local factors might be. But ultimately, you're going to arrive at a budgeted volume value for a time period. Because of this extreme volatility, what we've seen is that there is a less confidence, essentially, in these volume projections. So one thing that we've been working on at Kalibrate is to be able to take mobility data, so looking at actually what is going on during the most recent month, how has that compared to the past, and what does that mean in terms of what you should be able to achieve in terms of your volumes for that time period. So competitive insights for fuel pricing is the product that we're talking about here, and a discrete component of that is a volume estimator, which is able to feed those volume targets into Kalibrate pricing for the purposes of lots of purposes. But one of those purposes is for optimization and to be able to set the targets towards which optimization is hoping to achieve. So that's one of the ways that we can try and help our customers through these volatile times, in terms of knowing what to achieve and then how to price at the best possible price in order to make that to achieve that goal.
Thank you for listening to Fuel for Thought, Kalibrate's quarterly fuel industry podcast. If you'd like to continue the conversation, be sure to follow us on LinkedIn and subscribe to our monthly newsletter, The Decision Maker. If you'd like to find out more about how Kalibrate helps fuel retailers make better, data-driven decisions, visit kalibrate.com.